after I moved it to Vite, it now takes 1.5 seconds to start it.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's like 20 times faster.
Hi, welcome to JavaScript Jam. I am Ishan Nand, the CTO at Layer Zero.
And I'm Mark Mercado, the VP of Engineering at Layer Zero.
And today our guest is someone who truly needs no introduction. It's Evan Yu, the creator of the famous Vue framework. Evan,
Hello.
thanks for coming on and
Yeah,
welcome to JavaScript Jam. So, I actually, most people know you as the creator of Vue.js, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I really want to focus on your new project, and that's Vite. So why don't we start there first, and give us explain to folks what Vite is, and it'd be great to get a demo as well.
Sure. So Vite is a build tool, right? Essentially, it's also an attempt to sort of think about how we can just make building web applications with build tools just a bit easier and faster. Well, that's the main thing, right? Because over time we've gotten used to using bundlers like Webpack. Webpack is probably the biggest one, but as we all have experience, when you have a lot of files, when your project gets more complex, you have to wait for builds. Sometimes it gets kind of slow. Also, Webpack isn't the easiest thing to configure for, especially for beginners. So we have a lot of these meta frameworks. We had to build Vue CLI on top of Webpack just to, hide away all the complexity behind the configurations. So, but Vite is essentially saying, okay, over time, a lot of things, we just do it the same way across frameworks. A lot of the conventions like importing CSS or how we expect certain things to work. So why don't we just, reset it and start with something simpler, leaner, faster. Also, there is also this opportunity where the browsers today are supporting native ES modules. There are also a lot of new tools that's coming up that's targeting JavaScript but not written in JavaScript. For example, ES Build and SWC. So one is written in Go, one is written in Rust, but they both compile JavaScript, but they're like bounds and leaps faster than JavaScript written tools. So, but at the same time, just directly using them is still kind of challenging to build a real application, just because of all the things JavaScript developers are already used to. You want plugins, you want to be able to compile, have a dev server, hot module replacement, and all that stuff. So Vite is essentially, combining ES Build with the native ES module-based dev server. Put these two together, and then with a lot of experience and opinionated configuration that we pre-configure it for you, so you don't need to do too much to get started. Yeah, so I think it would be cool to just quickly jump into a demo to show what it is, because it's kind of abstract, right? I always struggle with explaining what it really is, but I think a demo will probably be easier. So let me share my screen here. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just in a fresh in a fresh directory. So I'm going to just quickly. So it's empty here. Okay. So I'm just going to say yarn the Vite, and as you can see, it's fast. I have it locally cached, but like this is a real install over the network. And it took like what, 2 seconds? I mean, I'm on a Mac, but it's still pretty fast, right? So once you have it installed, what you want to do, let me give myself a bit more space for the editor. So pretty standard stuff. So I'm going to just say index.html and maybe h1 hello Vite. Add some scripts. Actually, this step is sort of optional, but a lot of people like to. So, right. So at this step, don't think of it as build tool yet. Just think of it as a simple HTTP server. So I'm going to say, and the browser is here. Okay. So that's hello Vite. Maybe let's put it over here. So at this point, it doesn't do much yet, but you already get updates just by editing the HTML. It just reloads, right? This is literally like a static file server. So when you say main.js, say hello, hi, and I'm going to just main.js, right? This is literally how you develop this is all native JavaScript. Like this would work with over any simple file server, right? Now, the interesting part happens when you start to do things like rename this file to TS. And you can just do this, and it still works, right? So TypeScript just worked. And then you can also say style.css h1 color red, I guess. So you can obviously do it the old school way. Use the link, so style.css, and becomes red. Let's get rid of this alert because it's annoying. But now here the cool part is if you say green. Notice the page actually didn't reload, so CSS is actually hot updated. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And it works over this, right? So, but we can also remove this, and instead I'm gonna say import style.css. And it also just works, right? Again, if I update this, hot update, no reload. So a lot of developers are used to this, right? When you have a module system, when you have a build tool, but we're kind of used to have to build everything, have something process it to be able to get this kind of behavior. But here, everything is just working over ES modules and some custom, client hot update code handling the styles, right? So now, if you were to build a real application, I think this is interesting because for, say, most React developers or anyone who's used NPM, we're kind of used to seeing code like import React from React, right? Which obviously wouldn't work. I'm going to say, so it's going to tell you fail to resolve import React. Does the file even exist? If you're using a native HTTP file server, you're probably going to see something like React is not a valid import specifier because native ESM requires all the paths to be relative. So it does not know how to actually handle this bare import specifier. But Vite actually knows how to do it. So what I'm going to do here is let me open a new tab. I'm going to say yarn add React DOM. Okay. So now, if I reload the page, and we get React, right? And interestingly, because we know React doesn't actually ship native ES modules. React disk files are actually common JS, but so theoretically, you shouldn't be able to use named imports off of it, but we can actually do that here because Vite does have some of that interop so that a common JS module is actually wrapped into native ESM, so you can use named imports off of it. So this is also something we're kind of used to, but it's it's a pain. It's very painful if you were to handle this yourself to get all the common JS interop working. Right? So let's see. So I'm not an actual React developer, so I might be, making some weird mistakes here. But if you rename the file to TSX, we should be able to say import render from React DOM. So okay. bear with me here. So I say app return div hi render app document.getM by the app. So this should not work because we don't actually have a div here. Okay. So functions are not valid as a React child. Oh, of course. It should be this.
Yes,
all right. Cool. React is not defined. Okay.
yeah,
because
JSX requires that.
Yeah, all right. Okay, cool. All right, so we got hi here. So hi React. Right.
I love that you chose to use demo in React, 'cause it really underscores like this is not a React thing. This is about your
right.
Yeah.
It's not a React thing, it's not a Vue thing, it's framework agnostic. TSX just works here because ES Build already handles this for us, so it kind of comes for free. But by default, you don't get hot module replacement with this kind of setup, right? But the purpose of demoing it like this is notice that we didn't actually write a single line of configuration to get all this working. It literally works like a simple file server. And you get to actually already get pretty far by having CSS being importable, having TSX working out of the box.
How deep does that go? Like if I wanted to start importing SVGs as React components, does it do like the SVGR
then you have
thing?
to configure it. Yeah, you have to use plugins for that because different people might have different opinions on how you want to handle SVG files.
Yeah.
Okay. But there are some other things that that comes for free. For example, if you have an asset, you can import URL from say test.png, right? So this becomes part of the asset graph, which will be included in the final build static assets, and you get this URL will be the final resolved URL, a public path that you can use to embed into a markup. This comes for free, and then there's you can say import text from some foo.txt, like with the curve parameter raw. You can just import the file as plain text and get it here. So these are all built in, but on top of that, you probably want to do something more advanced like hot module replacement, or how do you support Vue, right? Then you need to use plugins. So just create a vite config.js. You can even use TS. So you can say import define config from Vite, export default define config. So this gives you full TypeScript-based auto completion IntelliSense documentation, like resolve. Tells you what is in there, right? Inline documentation tell you what you should use here. Full type supported configuration files. I can say plugins, vue.js plugin. Oh wait, I should install it first. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm saying yarn add d vue.js plugin view, and plugin view, and voila. So this should actually already give you Vue support. I think I need to okay, what does it say? Cannot find module. Oh yeah, because if you want to use Vue, I didn't install Vue packages themselves, obviously. So yarn add Vue at next. Yarn add the Vue compiler SFC. So if you use our scaffold, like this comes for free, right? So if you want to start a fresh one, you can use the npm. So npm init at vue.js app, which will give you guidance on what you want to scaffold. Like we have actually, like just demo here, we have vanilla, Vue, React, Preact. So once you pick one, you can also check if you want a TypeScript or JavaScript. So I'm not going to do that here, but you can try this yourself because we already have a project here. I want to demonstrate how it's actually not that difficult to actually scaffold it from zero yourself. So so I should have, I can actually have Vue and React working in the same project, and it's still kind of clean, right? You don't. Oh wait, there's not a lot of extra stuff here. So let's see. So if I restart the thing now, where is my, wait, why do I have my 3001 running? Oh, I think it's because I accidentally started it in my VS Code. I don't even know how to stop it. So
there's a great NPM module for that.
What am I even doing here? This is actually the first time I actually accidentally triggered that behavior in VS Code. Maybe it's something new. But
you could npm global install kill-port and then just kill port 3000. It's the greatest thing ever.
Whoops. So I'm just going to put this here. So I'm in here. Let's see. Okay, so scratch all that. Actually, let's keep this. I'm going to just start a different file, which is going to be our Vue entry. So I'm going to say import create app from Vue. Create app. Let's just make it empty for now because we don't have anything yet. And then I'm going to create a Vue file. Hello Vue. All right. And why is this thing here? How can I get rid of it?
It's like a debugging mode.
Yeah, I don't. How do I exit this? This? No? It's so weird. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it might be the button all the way to the right on here, that like disconnect button. I think it's like connected to a node debugging.
I believe this should give us something. Yeah, so the Vue file is working. And because it's a Vue file, it comes with hot module replacement out of the box. And as you can see, the only thing I had to do is just the Vue plugin and use it, and you get Vue file support. So same thing for React hot module replacement, a single plugin, and you essentially get most of what you need. Obviously, people want to write their own plugins, and the good news is Vite's plugin system is actually rollup compatible. So if you already know how to write rollup plugins, then you already know how to write Vite plugins. Vite plugin is a superset. It extends rollup plugin interface with a few Vite specific things, like you can transform HTML, the served HTML. You can do custom hot module replacement handling, but most users don't really need to deal with that themselves. So you got something working with great development experience, right? And it's very, very fast in the sense that if I restart the server, so I can start it in literally 100 milliseconds. I can also so notice here it actually pre-bundled Vue because. So if you look at the network request, it also makes things a lot easier to debug because the files are actually served at, over the network, right? So you can actually use the network tab to see the transpiled output. It's not a big unreadable bundle.
Giant bundle, yeah.
Yeah, right? So even a Vue file, right? Vue file actually goes through some pretty complex compilation, but here you can actually see the compiled code for each individual one. Which I think is pretty cool. So this is a dependency. As you can see, this dependency, so Vue internally actually has a bunch of small modules. It imports some dependencies, but Vite has pre-bundled the whole Vue dependency tree into a single file so that it's faster to serve over native VS modules, because the overhead here is actually the number of requests. So we do the pre-bundling here. The pre-bundling also is extremely fast because it's done with ES build. So I don't know, I can't think of something to, I don't know if I have something I can show here, but the common experience is, for example, you are using a huge library like the React Material Design, or especially projects that ships their source code in native VS modules in many small files. It will take a very long time for any bundler to actually bundle all the dependencies so that you can actually serve it inside here. But for Vite, it's a piece of cake because it's bundled using ES build. It's pre-bundled using ES build. So typically some numbers here is I got a project that took 28 seconds to start up with rollup, which is already a bit faster than Webpack. And after I moved it to Vite, it now takes 1.5 seconds to start up.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's like 20 times faster. Because most of the work is actually done when you're processing the dependencies. So this is a philosophy here, because Vite, in our projects, right, we have two types of code. One part is the source code. You can see these are the source code that I am writing. So these source code will change very often. And I also want to see them updates reflect instantly in the browser without having to reload the page.
Sure.
But my dependencies, I probably install them once, then I forget about them, and they don't really change. Sometimes you may need to manually edit them, but that's like extremely rare, right? So most of the times you install a dependency, they probably stay the same for a month. So in that sense, what's the point of processing them over and over again? So here's what Vite is doing is we are actually just pre-processing all your dependencies. Each dependency gets pre-compiled into one file. We have some metadata stored here, so the dev server can actually leverage that to serve them as fast as possible. And the metadata here has a hash. So basically, on subsequent server restarts, we notice if your dependency hash based on your lock file is the same, then we don't have to do anything to the dependency. We just use the already cached ones, right? So there's one level of cache here, right? So we avoid rebundling them on subsequent startups. And then there is another level of cache here. So if you look at this dependency header, as you can see, this is actually a very strong cache header here. It's basically telling the browser to cache it forever because it has this fingerprint here.
Yeah.
So on page reloads, as you can see, I disable cache here, but if I enable the cache and I reload here, you can see this dependency is actually read from this cache. So on page reloads, you're not paying the network cost again for any dependencies in your project. Only your source code. Also, your source code actually has, as you can see, they are actually getting, so this main TS here, the response is actually 304 because the server knows you haven't edited it since the last refresh. So what's the point of serving it again, right? So we're actually just these are just native ES modules, native requests. We're using HTTP headers to make sure your page reload, like even on hard reload, your page is still, reloads fast. Right. So a lot of these little details combined makes the whole development experience, very, very snappy, very fast. And this is something you kind of have to experience yourself, right? The common thing that we've heard on Twitter from a lot of people moving their existing projects over to Vite is like, oh my God, the dev server just starts like 10 times faster now, right? And we believe, when you have something that's so much faster, it creates a very fundamental different sort of experience when you work on something. Because like, if I have to wait for 20 seconds for dev server to start whenever I work on this thing, I'm going to be very reluctant to even think about it, right?
Yeah.
But having Vite available is especially like for me, right? Because I have to debug a lot of reproductions. People send me like bug repros with Vue single file components. Like previously, I like every time I see someone send me a full Vue CLI reproduction, I'm like, oh no, like install all the node modules, wait for Webpack to compile everything. It's usually like a minute or two before I can actually see the thing running. But with Vite, it's like, you know, it's so fast. Like I get everything up and running in like a few seconds. So it's a very different thing. When you have that fundamentally faster, more snappy experience, right?
It's so fast it changes what would be a difference of degree to a difference of kind. It's just so like it's a subconscious friction that you kind of just learn to live with in development, and you don't pause and think, oh, why is it this way? Like the analogy I like using for this kind of subconscious friction is actually, you know, the iPhone cable. You know, you used to have to orient it a certain way to plug it in. And then, you know, they said, you know, why do you have to do that? Like, you shouldn't have to think about it. It should just go in. It's like, you didn't realize, oh, all those 1,000 times I've been plugging that in, actually there's friction there I didn't even think about.
You know what's worse is like, I find myself interleaving tasks to try to just make the most of my time, because like, if I know I'm waiting for a Webpack production build, it's like, well, what can I get done in 30 seconds? It's not a good way to go about life.
Yeah, so that's kind of the gist about Vite. So one more thing you can you kind of get for free is so the development experience starts like just a simple file server, but the moment you want to send it to production, I'm going just to say Vite build and the builds, and then I say Vite preview. So this is what you would see in production. This is development. And it's pretty seamless because we try to be opinionated. The reason for us to be opinionated is because we want to make sure like everything you get in development, it should just work the same way in production. You shouldn't have to figure out like, they shouldn't be separate processes where like, okay, I have a nice dev server. Now I need to figure out how to actually build this thing, right? We don't want you to have to go through that process. So if you get something working during dev, it will just work in build. So you just build it and you deploy it. So that's one of the things, like we want to make sure it covers both instead of just focusing on the dev server part. So that, you know, that kind of forces us to be quite coupled to rollup in a sense. Like ideally, we want to actually leverage ES build for build as well. But you know, it's just that at this very point of time, like people have asked me like, why rollup? Why not just directly ES build, right? The thing is with ES build, there are still something that's kind of in flux. Rollup has been out there for a very long time. It basically covers most of the application bundling concerns that you can think of, like asset fingerprinting, code splitting, and also the ability to actually do some more advanced stuff. Like one of the things we do in Vite is when you have code splitting, you may have quite a few different async files that's importing one another. And one of the performance killer when you have that is nested imports, like A imports B and B imports C. So essentially you have to wait for two network round trips before you can actually have the whole module graph resolved. So you want to eliminate these nested imports. And Vite does that automatically for you by traversing the chunk graph at build time and make sure these nested imports are actually fetched in parallel. We also handle CSS code splitting out of the box. So when you have CSS imported from an async chunk, that part of CSS automatically split into its own file and fetched in parallel with the JavaScript of that chunk. So a lot of this stuff you can't really easily do by just throwing a bunch of files into a default build tool configuration, right? So you know, by being more opinionated about the whole thing, we're able to give you a better, more performant default out of the box. So these are different kind of trade-offs, right? Because people I guess this extends into when we compare this to some similar tools like Snowpack, because people often compare Vite with Snowpack, right? Snowpack, I think initially Snowpack was more like, we want you to actually deploy unbundled. We don't actually handle the bundling part. So Snowpack build actually transforms every file in isolation and then gives you a bunch of unbundled production files. But obviously, it's very difficult to actually deploy that in a performant fashion. So you still have to, like today, you still have to actually bundle them. And when you bundle them, you have to use additional optimizers, right? So one of the upside of going unbundled first is you can use different end bundlers to handle those files. But the downside is you can't afford to be as opinionated in certain areas like Vite is, right? So essentially the trade-off is because we stick with one single bundler, we're able to do something that's very, very specific, but get you the most performance possible.
Do you have examples of, like you mentioned that in development time, you've got a 20x improvement before and after. Is there examples you maybe have off the cuff of sites that actually improved or projects that improved in their user performance because of the better?
That is kind of difficult because this kind of optimization, you have to have very specific cases that actually have the pieces. But so right now we don't really have real stories like that because I mean it's early. Like people don't even actually tell us they're using Vite. Like we have to dig ourselves. But I think some more context would probably be helpful. Let me find the part here. So this is a common situation where in a large application, you may have your entry, then you have two routes, right? Routes are code split into async chunks, and these two routes actually have a common dependency. So this is split into a shared chunk. This creates what we call a nested import because by default, when you navigate to this route, it have to first import this shared chunk. Which results in two network requests. So what Vite does is at build time, we convert this dynamic import call to import A and C in parallel. And then, so that when both are imported, then we resolve it, chunk A. So essentially we're like moving this nested import ahead of time by analyzing this graph at build time, right?
Do you have an ability to do that in like the link headers as well? So that how are you signifying that?
So here's this thing, right? In link headers, those are what we call preload directives, right? We generate those automatically, but if these are actually lazy, when you code split, you're meant to load them lazily. If you load everything up front, then you kind of defeat the purpose of it. Like especially on mobile, if you have like 20 routes, you don't want to preload them all at once. It's gonna So it's kind of a trade-off, like depends on. If you only have a few routes, you can actually say manually force all of them to be preloaded up front. Or you can use intersection observer to load them, which is what we do in vpress. But but this is the safest default optimization. Should benefit you in all cases.
Taking a step back, has ES module compatibility come up as a issue? Like, just maybe let the audience know. I think it's basically everything except IE. Right.
So for Vite, in development, you need native ES modules, right? So Vite is essentially positioned as to be modern first, which means we target browsers that support native ES modules as a baseline by default. But we do have an official legacy plugin that allows you to actually target down to arbitrary browsers. So the thing is, so we because we bundle for production, right? So we can actually inject a system.js, small system.js loader, and then use rollup to to output system.js modules instead of native JS modules, so which allows us to actually run on legacy browsers as well.
Oh, that's great.
So it's actually possible. Yeah.
So, stepping back, how did you get started? Like, on building, another big, project outside of Vue, and decided to start tackling this area? Was it frustration? Was it like, what's kind of the background here? What kind of inspired you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it has partly to do with the frustration because so first of all, I have to I personally do a lot of bug reproductions, right? I'm gonna start sharing my screen.
Yeah, we can stop that. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, like, whenever I want to start a small side project, VCLI has really gotten to the point where it's kind of become this mental deterrence. Like, just thinking about installing hundreds of megabytes of node modules just makes me reluctant to start a new project. And that, the overall slowness just kind of chips away at you.
Yeah.
And so I always have this personal itch of wanting to. It's also for the Vue users, right? Because just thinking that, every Vue user starting a new VCLI project has to actually wait for this long to get started, it's not a good feeling. So I've always kind of wanted to scratch that itch and find something lighter and faster, right? So I've considered just moving to Rollup in the past, but Rollup doesn't really have a good dev server story. And hot module replacement is kind of a really important thing if you have something large and you don't want to like reload the page on every update. So at one point, we do have a feature in Vue CLI called Vue. I can't even remember the name, but the idea is you start with very minimal setup. It's actually a global command where you just say Vue serve a file, and it just start instantly, but it's still Webpack based. So one time I was thinking, so I saw the native JS modules becoming available in Chrome one day, and I was like, wait a second, if I have a dev server, that's an HTTP request. So if that's an HTTP request, I can actually, so basically the idea was if the browser is sending an HTTP request asking for a Vue file, but I compile it on the server and send JavaScript back instead, wouldn't that actually just like be compiling everything on the fly? So we don't even need a bundler anymore. So that was the initial idea that kind of clicked. So I started this really early prototype called @Vue dev server. It's actually archived now. Let's see if we can still find it. Yeah, it's here. So, I'm not sharing the screen, but yeah, let's see, when was it actually started? So this thing was like more than 2 years ago. So the idea came around in March 2019. I got a very basic proof of concept working, and then dropped it because I couldn't figure out hot module replacement back then. And also because I felt like, native JS modules was still early and people would kind of be reluctant to rely on it as a requirement for development. So, but a year later, it became more widespread. And then I somehow had I don't know, I just randomly came up with the idea, maybe we can do hot module replacement this way for native JS modules. Then I pulled an all-nighter, got another proof of concept working, and that was the initial kind of the prototype for Vite. So that was the 0.x for Vite. So once you have that proof of concept going, right? It's kind of a very, it's kind of that sort of creativity rush where I just recently tweeted on Twitter saying like, the first 0 to 1% is always very exciting. Then the first 50% is very fun because you're like, oh my God, we can get this working too. We can get that working too. Like this is coming together very nicely. And then you reach a point where you're like, all the fun stuff has been done, and you have to start like fixing all the edge cases.
Yep.
So it becomes a grind at a point. There was a period of time when we were in the 0.x. Every day I'm pretty much just fixing bugs for all these crazy package compatibility issues because the ecosystem. There are so many packages that are written assuming it's going to just work with Webpack. And Webpack has just so much magic, like auto polyfills node built-ins. It handles mixed CJS and ESM usage. A lot of things that, because the initial assumption is, okay, Vite is going to be pure ESM, no CJS whatsoever. And quickly we realized, okay, that's probably not practical if we actually want to let people use this. Just because the ecosystem is just, there's just so much existing packages that people want to use, but they somehow have all these assumptions about what a bundler should be doing. So luckily, a lot of the heavy lifting is now handled by ESBuild. So so we had to do a lot less. I mean, but over the process, we kind of learned the lesson, and it's really a grind getting the thing to even something that's usable, right? So now you can hear stories of people saying, okay, I just switched my Vue CLI project to Vite in a few hours. I just switched my Create React app to Vite in a few hours. That's all possible because we went through this whole process of just like finding out all these edge cases and finding ways to work around them. So that kind of got wear on me for a bit. I think I got it to a stage where I think it's like 1.0 RC. Then I just put it there because I want to drop it a little bit back, switch context back on work on Vue for a bit. So I worked on Vue for a few months. Then I came back and took another look at Vite. I was like, a lot of lessons learned. And the initial architecture, we saw some shortcomings. And we also kind of want to think about how the build story, like a plugin system that would allow you to, I guess the biggest drawback of the initial version of 0.x Vite was that our dev server and the build process is very separated. So we're not actually sharing the maximum amount of code possible, right? Because most of the code transform is actually the same, and they should be same. They should be calling the same code when you're transforming the code, say compiling the TSX or that. But we're duplicating a lot of that. So 2.0 was like a big refactor, actually almost a complete rewrite, making sure that we can offer a nice plugin system, which is partly inspired by WMR, which is also a ES module-based dev server from the Preact team. They first, in fact, there was even earlier, there were projects, I think there was a project called NoLup that has this idea of, so NoLup was basically trying to run rollup in the browser. WMR came up with this idea of, okay, we don't necessarily want to emulate entire rollup, but we can use rollup's plugin interface to allow people to define their own plugins. So V2 kind of built on that idea a bit further, and then we built a superset on top of that. We also use rollup as the actual production bundler. So so the end result, I think, is pretty pleasant. Because personally, I enjoyed when I was writing rollup plugins, I kind of liked how simple the interface is. It's really simple and straightforward. Whereas compared to my experience writing Vue loader for Webpack, it was pretty complicated. And a lot of the stuff is I mean, it's not really well documented. You kind of have to either read the source code and just look at other plugins, like how are they using it? Then you kind of trial error until it works. But in comparison, the Rollup plugin interface is something you can read in a day and then you figure out how to use it. So so the end result, I like it quite a bit. I think we've it's something that kind of also is beneficial because a lot of people who've been previously using Rollup feels right at home when they use Vite, right? A lot of the plugins can even just, Rollup plugins can even just work as is directly as a Vite plugin. So we are essentially sort of leveraging a bit of the existing ecosystem from Rollup, and kind of maybe you can also think of Vite as a companion to Rollup, where previously if you use Rollup, you kind of have to figure out your own dev server solution, but now you can just use Vite.
So Evan, let me ask you, I want to ask about meta frameworks because I'm really jealous watching all this. Like I do most of my work in Next.js and Nuxt, and I want this now. Especially, it's very timely because today I was working on our support for SvelteKit, and SvelteKit's based on Vite. Like how familiar are you with SvelteKit? Is it a pretty standard use of Vite?
I think it is. I think SvelteKit, I personally haven't really used it, but previously it was Sapper, I think.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it's also sort of Next inspired, right? So it it's essentially Next for Svelte. So in that sense, these server SSR meta frameworks kind of have similar needs in terms of what they do. That is, you still need the dev server. You still need, it's essentially an extension of the pure client-side experience but you also want to be able to have server-side rendering. So, I mean, I essentially designed the initial architecture for how to do Vue server-side rendering when we first introduced server-side rendering in Vue, which then evolved into, so Nuxt is basically built on top of that initial architecture. And that was based on Webpack. And it involves like bundling your application twice, essentially once for client and once for server. Yeah. And then on every file update, you're actually rebundling the two bundles, which can be kind of slow, right? So when I was working on Vite 2, I always had this hope that, we can, in the future, we can have a meta framework that's built on top of Vite. But in order to do that, we need to solve the problem because of how do we run ES modules in Node.js for server-side rendering? Because all the source code, right? The dev server, the reason the dev server is fast because we're actually serving the code as actual ES modules. But how do you run them in Node.js? Now Node.js has actually ES module support, but there are a lot of tricky things you need to handle, especially like when you can't assume the user actually always, if they are using like Node 10, which don't actually have native ES modules, how do you get the server-side rendering working? So Rich Harris, who's author of Svelte, and he came up with this idea. I think their initial version of SvelteKit was based on Snowpack, but none of these new dev servers actually handle server-side rendering back then. So Rich came up with the idea of doing a lightweight transform on the fly for each ES module. So luckily, because ES module syntax is so statically analyzable, it's very safe to transform. So you can actually transform the ES module syntax into a kind of like creating your own Node.js module wrapper. Then we instantiate them. We are essentially constructing all your modules and instantiating them virtually in Node.js, and which allows us to invalidate them individually, just like doing hot module replacement for the browser using similar logic. So Vite already maintains a module graph for hot module replacement analysis. So we basically essentially reuse that for the server side as well. So which gives us a pretty efficient server side runtime for ES modules. So the initial idea, of course, is thanks to Rich for coming up with this. So they came up with that when they were trying to use Snowpack for SvelteKit, and then I implemented that in Vite as well, and Rich saw that because I essentially basically I tweeted saying, okay, we got this running thanks to Rich's idea, and Rich saw that. I think he probably saw that. Okay, so if Vite can do this, and I mean, I think the reason they eventually switched to Vite is because Vite is a bit more opinionated in the, as I mentioned, in the build part, where we have SSR now, we have build, we have the dev service story. So if you want to build a meta framework, there's really not much reason for you to reinvent the wheel in these areas if that already fits your build. So I think that's why for SvelteKit, they're essentially saying, okay, like we will have to figure out the build story, but Vite already does it. So we can just leverage it instead of inventing our own wheels. I think that's one of the reasons why they, essentially it's kind of like where the scope of the thing is. Vite is not in itself a meta framework, but it does quite a bit, which makes it easier for you to build a meta framework on top of it.
Yeah, so SvelteKit's still under development, so it has like no baggage. But more established frameworks like Next and Nux, like how hard is it going to be to switch those over to a modern tool chain or hopefully to Vite?
Yeah, it depends on how coupled the framework core is coupled to the bundler they're using. I don't know about Next, but it seems they are also working on some like dev experience performance improvements. So I don't know the details, but they just hired Tobias, so I think they're gonna come up with something. Yeah. In terms of Next, so the cool thing is when they started working on Next 3, I think they started with the assumption that it's probably have to be builder agnostic to some extent, because they don't. I think the initial design premise was that don't be too coupled to Webpack. So most of the core of Next is designed to be bundler agnostic, which is why they were. It's crazy because after I released Vite 2, Next team actually got a demo running Next 3 on Vite, like very short, like in a few days. Because the architecture, they're coming. I think Next 3 has a lot of interesting stuff coming. Like, I personally don't even have a full comprehension of like all the stuff they're doing, but they have some cool packages that just being able to nicely extract Next core and then just like swap. They have a version that can run on Webpack. They have a version that can run on Vite. So I'm also kind of pretty looking forward to see how it turns out to be. But I know there are people who have currently running Next projects being able to use the Next Vite module and actually get it running. So I'm not 100% clear on the technical details either, but the bottom line is I know Next can already run on Vite, maybe not in the 100% efficient, way. It leverages Vite to some extent. It's probably not using Vite's server-side rendering runtime, but just for serving client-side modules, it's probably I think it already works. So it really depends on the design, like how you want the meta framework to be, how coupled you want the meta framework to be coupled to a certain tool. I think SvelteKit is pretty deeply coupled with Vite, but Next is obviously trying to be a bit more build tool agnostic.
Yeah, we had the Next CTO actually on a previous episode, and they definitely, it sounds like, want while trying to be less builder centric, still keep up with what's happening there. But I'd encourage folks to listen to that episode. We had a whole list of Vue questions we want to get to, but we're already at time. So I think we'll have to do a part 2. I would love, there's so many things I want to ask you about and talk about on the Vue side, just the efficient rendering and React server components, your thoughts there. But we're gonna have to save that for, I think, a part 2. Just to close us out, you know, as it relates to Vite, what should folks look forward to in the future?
For Vite, so things probably going to slow down a bit. We want to stabilize it. We are getting a lot of new users, a lot of issues. So there's a lot of just daily maintenance going on. So we want to probably slow down a little bit. I'm actually diverting a bit of most of my attention back to Vue because we have a lot of work here as well. So in the short term, it's probably most just stabilization. Want to make sure we fix the edge cases. We're still discovering a lot of, because it's still really young, right? I think stabilization is going to be a major theme for the next few months. And then on top of that, we have some ideas on taking the performance even further. And once ES builds application bundling fully stabilizes, we hope we can have a mode where you can actually build your application with ES build directly. So that would make the build also 10 times, 20 times faster. So hopefully that can happen. But for now, it's mostly making sure everything, there will be because our long-term eventual goal is like, especially for new Vue projects, we want users to start with Vite because it's just a much lighter and faster experience. We don't want to intimidate users, especially beginners, like, people make enough jokes about modern front-end development being so heavy, you know? We want to just dial it down a little bit.
And Vue 3 is starting with Vite out of the box, is that correct? Or not
so
yet?
We want to, we are probably going to update our documentation and everything later this year. So the initial introductory workflow, especially if people want to start with the tooling route, is just install Vite and you can get a project running in no time.
Okay. And then what's the best way for people to keep up with Vite and to follow you online?
So my Twitter handle is Youyuxi. We can probably edit this in, YOUYUXI. And then if you want to follow Vite, the Twitter account is @Vite_JS. Unfortunately, both Vite and Vite.js are already occupied, so we had to go with underscore.
Before we close out, how did you pick the name Vite, actually?
Vite is the French word for fast. Yeah.
Okay. That makes
just like Vue is the French word for view. So.
Okay.
Cool.
That makes a ton of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining JavaScript Jam, and we look forward to having you in a part 2, and we'll talk about Vue.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Evan.